We're in Mark chapter 6 this morning, and we've been talking about for the last couple of lessons about the miracle of Jesus feeding the multitude of 5,000 men, and that leads into what happens at the end of the chapter here. And so we've talked about it for a couple of lessons. We're going to look at a little bit more concerning that miracle today and talk about the aftermath of it, because there's some interesting things that take place that we need to kind of look a little more closely at to understand what is happening here and what's going on. Mark kind of covers them briefly and just gives a mention of some things. And if we're not careful, we might misunderstand, some of the things that he says. So we want to look closely at that, and then we'll get into the last part of the chapter here, where Jesus performs another miracle of walking on the water. So the end of the story of this miracle is in verse 44, where it says, "They that did eat of the loaves were about 5,000 men." And verse 45 says, "And straightway he constrained his disciples to get into the ship and to go to the other side before unto Bethsaida, while he sent away the people. And when he had sent them away, he departed into a mountain to pray. And when the even was come, the ship was in the midst of the sea, and he alone on the land. And he saw them toiling and rowing, for the wind was contrary unto them. And about the fourth watch of the night, he cometh unto them, walking upon the sea, and would have passed them by. But when they saw him walking upon the sea, they supposed it had been a spirit, and cried out. For they all saw him, and were troubled. And immediately he talked with them, and saith unto them, Be of good cheer, it is I, be not afraid. And he went up unto them into the ship, and the wind ceased. And they were sore amazed in themselves beyond measure, and wondered. For they considered not the miracle of the loaves, for their heart was hardened." And then we have the last part in those last few verses. So we're going to talk about that miracle, but before we do, there's some important little details that are mentioned, and some things that Mark points out that we need to look at a little more closely. So first of all, when Jesus and his disciples were trying to get away from the crowd to come to this place to have some time of rest after they're going out into what we call the limited commission and preaching, and after they found out about the death of John the Baptist, they were attempting to get away from the crowd. And we remember, and we've talked about several times, that the crowd followed them anyway. And Jesus, when he saw them, verse 34 says, when he came out, saw much people, and was moved with compassion toward them, because they were as sheep not having a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. And so when the crowd showed up anyway, Jesus, he didn't see it as an obstacle or a hindrance or something that was going to ruin his day or his plans, but he was moved with compassion toward them. And we've said it several times, but we have to learn that lesson of always being compassionate toward others. Sometimes I hear a lot of people say nowadays things like, when we look at the world around us and they say, I just hate people and I don't want to be around people. I'm going to sit at home by myself and not have to deal with the world. But as Christians, people are our business. That's what we're here for, to save souls. And we can't isolate ourselves from the world, because we have the hope for the world. And so when Jesus saw people and when they interfered with his plans and he's not going to be able to do what he had planned to do, he didn't send them away and say, leave me alone, I'm going to take care of myself. But he had compassion on them. And we have to learn to have that same kind of attitude. But at the end of this miracle, one of the interesting things is that after he feeds the 5,000, verse 45, he tells his disciples, constrained them, instructed them very strongly to get into the ship and to go to the other side. And then verse 46, he sent them away, and then he departed into the mountain to pray. So he sent the disciples away, and then he sent the multitude away. So when they first showed up, Jesus didn't send them away, even though that's probably what we would think he would do, because they were trying to get away from the crowd. He didn't send them away, and he performs this amazing miracle, and now he is sending them away. So what's changed? Why would Jesus not send them away then, but he is now? That's one thing we have to consider. Secondly, as Jesus sends the disciples away, he goes up into a mountain by himself to pray. Now, why would Jesus do this after you've just had, as you read Mark's account, this tremendous miracle? This great crowd has followed him. He's performed this wonderful feat that has demonstrated his power and his deity, and all these good things have happened. Why is now the time that he needs to be by himself to pray? A third thing we notice is that while he was on the land, he could see the disciples in the boat, indicating they hadn't gotten too far in their trying to get away, and the wind was contrary to them. So he knows that he sent them away, and this storm has come up, and they're trying to get to the other side, but they can't, and he sees them struggling with the storm. Yet as we read, Mark says at the end of verse 48 that he was walking upon the sea and would have passed by them. Now, why would Jesus see his disciples in the boat struggling, and he's out here walking on the water miraculously, but he's planning just to walk on by? Why was he going to pass by them and not stop and help them or do something for them? So we need to understand that. And then lastly, he says in verse 52 that they considered not the miracle of the loaves, for their heart was hardened. How had the disciples' hearts become hardened after seeing this miracle that Jesus performed? Mark doesn't really explain those things to us because that's not the purpose of his gospel account, and his point is to, get to the miracle and to, the application of it. But we have some explanation found in the other gospel accounts, and particularly in John, which we're going to look at in just a minute. But I want us to think about those things that happen here and kind of the strangeness of it from what we've been reading in Mark's account and how things have gone, and try to wrap our minds around why Jesus is acting the way that he is here. It seems different from how he was, just a few verses before when he was performing this miracle for the multitude. So if you notice, as we read in verse 52, it said they didn't consider the miracle of the loaves. And this miracle of feeding the 5,000 is going to come up several times after it happened. This is one occasion. There's another occasion where the disciples are questioning among themselves, and Jesus says, "Don't you remember how we fed the multitude miraculously?" There's even another miracle where he feeds another multitude of 3,000 men, almost in imitation of this same miracle, emphasizing the significance and the importance of what happened here on this occasion. So all the miracles are important, and they all have their place in the events of Jesus' life. But this one stands out for several reasons and comes up on several occasions in relationship to his disciples and what they were supposed to learn and to understand. So to fix all of that in our minds, I want us to go to John's account of the gospel in John chapter 6, where this miracle is recorded. And notice some things that John teaches us that help to explain what's happening here. Someone has said, I forget exactly who it was, but that John is a divine commentary on Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And I think that's a good way to look at it. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are all written to specific audiences, and John is written generally to everyone. But what John does is to take the same story of Jesus' life, and it's not a story, it's an actual historical record, but he takes the events of Jesus' life and he puts it in the context of this is God. This is what it's like when God is present, on the earth. And so he explains some things that maybe we don't see as we're just reading the events recorded in the other gospel accounts. But here in John 6, verse 1 says, "After these things, Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias, and a great multitude followed him because they saw his miracles which he did on them that were diseased." And notice that they followed him because they saw the miracles. Verse 3 says, "Jesus went up into a mountain, and there he sat with his disciples. And the Passover, a feast of the Jews, was nigh. When Jesus then lifted up his eyes and saw a great company come unto him, he saith unto Philip, Whence shall we buy bread that these may eat? And this he said to prove him, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered him, 200 pennyworth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may take a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, saith unto him, There is a lad here which hath 5 barley loaves and 2 small fishes, but what are they among so many? And Jesus said, Make the men sit down. Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down in number about 5,000. And Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed to the disciples, and the disciples to them that were set down, and likewise of the fishes as much as they would. When they were filled, he said unto his disciples, Gather up the fragments that remain, that nothing be lost. Therefore they gathered them together and filled 12 baskets with the fragments of the 5 barley loaves, which remained over and above unto them that had eaten. So that's the record of the miracle. Same as Mark, different details are highlighted, and we have the instruction to Philip and then Andrew's actions and those things. But the miracle is the same. Now notice verse 14. It says, Then those men, when they had seen the miracle that Jesus did, said, This is of a truth that prophet that should come into the world. When Jesus therefore perceived that they would come and take him by force to make him a king, he departed again into a mountain himself alone. So here we find out a very important detail, that after Jesus had performed this miracle, the people, seeing it and witnessing it and understanding what Jesus had done physically, decided that it was time to take him by force and make him their king. Now, there are a couple of things there. One is that they wanted to force Jesus to be king, but the other thing is when it talks about taking him by force and making him king, they were ready for the revolution. They said, This is the Messiah. And when the Messiah comes, he's going to overthrow the Roman government and set us up as a kingdom on the earth. And we, the nation of Israel, we are going to rule the world. And so Jesus has done these miracles of healing the sick. Now he's fed the multitude miraculously, and they say, We're ready. Herod's palace is just right over here, right down the road. Let's go. And let's go throw him out. He just killed John the Baptist. We're tired of this. Let's take our new king and let's go overthrow the government and install Jesus as king, and he'll establish this kingdom, and he'll feed us every day miraculously. We won't have to work to provide our food. When we get sick, he'll heal us. Whatever we need, he's able to provide miraculously. This is the man we want as our king. Now remember, before he did the miracle, that Jesus saw them as sheep without a shepherd, and Mark told us that he taught them many things. And Luke 9 and 11 tells us that he taught them about the kingdom. So Jesus, before he performed this miracle, was teaching them about the kingdom that he was going to establish, a spiritual kingdom, not a physical one. Yet when he performs this miracle, the people who are expecting a physical kingdom see the miracle as a sign of what this physical kingdom will be, and they're ready to force Jesus to be their king and then to overthrow Rome and to set up this new nation of Israel that's going to rule the world. And so Jesus sends them home. He says, It's time for you to leave, and he sends the disciples away, and he goes up into a mountain by himself to pray. So that gives us insight as to why Jesus did what he did on those 2 instances, sending the crowd away, because they didn't understand what he was trying to teach them, and why he needed to be alone to pray. Tremendous miracle had been performed. Everybody was pleased with what had taken place, but they completely missed the point of it and what Jesus was doing and what he was trying to teach them by his words and also by the miracle. And so he needed time to pray. You remember that one of the temptations that Jesus faced from the devil in Matthew chapter 4 was that the devil told him, If you'll bow down before me, I'll give you all the kingdoms of the earth. Well, this is the same thing, generally speaking here, that this is the nation of Israel saying, We want you to be our king, and we accept you, and we will follow you, and we will honor you, and whatever you say, that's what we'll do, which is what Jesus wanted, right? He wanted the people to accept him as king, but as his kind of king, God's king of a spiritual kingdom, not a kingdom that fit their own ideas and their own wishes and their own desires. So there's a sense in which there's a temptation here to follow the ideas of men here and to become a king and to rule the world in that way, which of course would fail because it's not what God's plan or purpose was. And so there's that comparison to the temptation of Jesus, and so he needs to be alone to pray. But also, and I think maybe more than that, more than being tempted by it, there's probably, I want to use the right word, maybe discouragement or heartbreak on the part of Jesus that everything that he's done and everything that he's taught and this great crowd that has sacrificed so much and that ran from their homes to find him and to be where he is, they just don't understand it and they don't get it. And they're so deceived by the teaching of the Pharisees, by the traditions of men, that no matter what he does or what he says, they just can't accept the truth. They won't see him for what he's supposed to be and what he's trying to teach them. So he goes off by himself to pray. Now, read a little further in John's account and notice what happens. Verse 16 says, "When even was now come, his disciples went down into the sea and entered into a ship and went over the sea toward Capernaum, as it was now dark, and Jesus was not come to them. And the sea arose by reason of a great wind that blew. So when they had rowed about 25 or 30 furlongs, they see Jesus walking on the sea and drawing nigh unto the ship, and they were afraid. But he saith unto them, It is I, be not afraid. Then they willingly received him into the ship, and immediately the ship was at the land whither they went." And so Mark tells us that Jesus was going to pass them by, and that they saw him and thought it was a ghost, and they cried out. And Jesus, of course, came to them. John tells us when he got into the boat, they were immediately at the other side of the sea to the land where they were going. Why was Jesus going to pass them by? Why was he just walking by his disciples? Part of the reason seems to be because when the crowd wanted Jesus to be made king, the disciples went along with that way of thinking. Remember that Mark told us their heart was hardened. Mark said that they didn't understand the miracle that Jesus had performed of feeding the multitude, and their heart was hardened. That doesn't mean they were hardened against Jesus, that they didn't believe in him or that they didn't want to follow him, but their hearts were hardened to the truth about who he was and about what he was doing, that he was come to set up a spiritual kingdom, not a physical one. And so his disciples were in the wrong with the rest of the crowd. And so Jesus not only has been trying to teach the multitude and to confirm what he's teaching by these miracles over and over again, but even those who were closest to him, the 12, who had been with him every day and who had heard him, not just when he's preaching a sermon or teaching the multitude, but they had intimate conversation and fellowship with him, they still don't get it. And they still don't understand who he is and what he's trying to do. So when he sent the crowd away, he sent them away also because their hearts were hardened. And he's walking by. Whatever his plan was and his purpose was to get to where they were going, he was passing by his disciples until they saw him. And part of it's because they had hardened their heart. And one of the key things in that miracle, of course, is that Jesus doesn't force himself on anyone. That if you're not going to accept the truth of who he is, then he'll let you go your merry way, through life. And his disciples hadn't accepted the truth about who he was and what he was doing, and so they're going to be struggling in a storm. Well, they'll struggle in a storm because of their rejection of what Jesus was trying to teach them. But they had to take the initiative and the action to call out to him. And as John tells us here, and it's important wording in verse 21, he says they willingly received him into the ship. So the Lord, is there, and Jesus, is present, and his truth is real, and his salvation is available, but we have to call out to him, and we have to willingly receive him into our lives by submitting to the truth about who he is and about what his gospel teaches. And his disciples were still struggling with that. And so that's part of what's going on there when Jesus has them out in the middle of the sea struggling on their own, because they were trying to do it on their own anyway. They were following their own idea about who Jesus was and what the kingdom was supposed to be. So he lets them struggle with that spiritually and emotionally, and that's demonstrated physically with the storm. And he would walk by and let them continue with that struggle as long as they wanted to. It's kind of like Jacob wrestling with the angel. Jacob had been wrestling with God all of his life. He wanted the birthright, but he didn't trust God to give it to him the way that God had said he would. He wrestled with God's plan, and so he and his mother did it their own way by deception. And he wrestled with God and left and wrestled with God through the story with Laban, and he's constantly struggling with just submitting to God's will. And God let him do it. And he spent so many years of his life in that struggle until finally he wrestled with God himself in that miraculous appearance that took place. And he understood that he couldn't beat him. He couldn't beat Jehovah, but Jehovah couldn't beat him either. Meaning that God would not impose his will upon Jacob. Jacob had to accept it and submit to it. And so the Lord touched the hollow of his thigh, and Jacob limped, because God can affect our situation, but he doesn't force himself upon anyone. And Jacob finally understood that, and he stopped fighting with God and submitted to him. And that's what he should have been doing all along. So here are the disciples wrestling with what Jesus is saying and what they've heard all their lives that the kingdom is supposed to be and who the Messiah is supposed to be and all of those things. And the Lord lets them wrestle with it. But when they invite him in, then of course he shows up, as he always does. Now, just for the sake of emphasis that that's what's going on here, continue with me here in John 6 and notice what happens. The verse 22 says, "The day following, when the people which stood on the other side of the sea saw that there was none other boat there, save the one whereunto his disciples were entered, and that Jesus went not with his disciples into the boat, but that his disciples were gone away alone. Howbeit there came other boats from Tiberias nigh to the place where they did eat bread, after that the Lord had given thanks. When the people therefore saw that Jesus was not there, neither his disciples, they also took shipping and came to Capernaum, seeking for Jesus." So the disciples sail across the sea. The people see the disciples leave, but Jesus didn't leave. He went up into the mountain. So some of them are still waiting for Jesus. Well, the next day they find out Jesus is not here either. So he walked across the sea. So they know that Jesus and his disciples are gone, and they want to go to where he is. And so they get boats for themselves, whatever they have to do, to make it across the sea or around the sea to get to Capernaum. And so they're seeking for Jesus based on what he had done in that miracle. And notice that it says again at the end of verse 23, there came other boats from Tiberias and so forth to the place where they did eat bread, after that the Lord had given thanks. I always think it's interesting there that it's pointed out to us again that when they ate bread, or before they ate bread, Jesus gave thanks for it. He was thankful for his meal. And even in just talking about it in passing, we're reminded that Jesus gave thanks before they ate. That's important for us to do. But anyway, it's a place where they ate bread, so that miracle is motivating them. So verse 25, when they found him on the other side of the sea, they said unto him, Rabbi, when camest thou hither? Jesus answered them and said, Verily, verily, I say unto you, ye seek me, not because ye saw the miracles, but because ye did eat of the loaves and were filled. Labor not for the meat which perisheth, but for that meat which endureth unto everlasting life, which the Son of Man shall give unto you, for him hath God the Father sealed. Now think about what Jesus says here. You have this crowd who the day before had run out from their homes and had followed Jesus to this place, and he had compassion on them They were like sheep needing a shepherd. And so he taught them and he healed the sick, and then he fed the multitude miraculously. And then they want to take him by force and make him king, and Jesus sends everybody away, and he goes into a mountain to pray. And then at night, he walks across the sea, gets in the boat with his disciples there at the other side, Gennesaret. And now the next day, here comes this crowd again trying to get to him however they have to, by boats or by land, walking, whatever they had to do to get to him. And when they get there, they say, when did you come here? And Jesus doesn't say to them, I'm so proud of you for all this effort you've put forth to get to where I am. You are true disciples. Instead, what he says is, the only reason that you've come all this way is because you got a free meal yesterday. Not even because of the miracle of it, that what Jesus had done was miraculous, and they understood that power demonstrated that this is the Son of God, but all they cared about was the food. That this is somebody who can feed us, and so we want him to be our king, so we don't ever have to worry about food anymore, about famine or about sickness or any of those things. So he says to them, the kind of effort that you put forth to get to me for another free meal, you need to be laboring just as diligently for the meat that doesn't perish, the truth that I am teaching. In other words, you need to be seeking me for the message, not for the miracle, for the truth, not for the food. But their attitude, their heart was only focused on the physical rather than the spiritual. So verse 28 really kind of seals it when it says that then said they unto him, what shall we do that we might work the works of God? So if you're not going to feed us miraculously, what do we need to do so we can feed ourselves miraculously? So we can do the works of God. We want to be able to do those miracles that you're doing. What do we need to do? Now Jesus' answer in verse 29 is, this is the work of God, that ye believe on him whom he hath sent. The miracles, that's not the work of God. Even though they had their place and their purpose, and it, of course, was God's work, the work that they needed to do was to believe on Jesus. Not believe in their interpretation of who Jesus was, not believe in what they wanted Jesus to be, but who he actually was. They needed to see the truth about him. And by the way, that verse says that believing is a work. Our friends in the religious world say that salvation is by faith only because salvation is not by works. And if you think you're saved by works, then you deny the grace of God. Well, faith is a work, and this verse says it. But nevertheless, Jesus is saying you need to see things as they actually are and believe that. So look at verse 30. They said therefore unto him, what sign showest thou then, that we may see and believe thee? What dost thou work? And you think, are you kidding me? What miracle can I perform? What sign can I give you to show that I'm telling you the truth? I just miraculously created food out of thin air and fed 5,000 people. And you're asking for a sign, for a miracle? But notice what they say. Our fathers did eat manna in the desert, as it is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat. They say, you see, if you really are the Messiah, this is what you're supposed to do. Feed us physical food so we don't have to worry about it anymore. Just like in the wilderness, God gave them manna from heaven. They don't care about his deity. They don't care about his true identity. They don't care about his gospel. They don't care about the spiritual kingdom. All they want is the material blessings that come with following Jesus. And so Jesus went up into a mountain to pray, I'm convinced, because he knew what was going to happen on this next day. The end of the chapter says, from that time, many of his disciples went away and walked no more with him. Most of this multitude that had been following him now abandons him. And I believe Jesus was praying for these souls who are about to make the decision to be lost for all eternity because they would not allow themselves to accept the truth about Jesus and his kingdom. that it's not about material blessings, it's not about miracles, it's about the forgiveness of sins and the spiritual blessings that he was coming to bring them. And so, understanding what was coming, all this popularity and all of this acceptance, and they want him to be their king, knowing that on the next day the tables were going to turn and they're going to hate him and they don't want anything to do with him anymore, and they're going to go along with the Jewish leadership to betray him and to undermine him and to kill him. I think that's why Jesus was praying on the mountain alone, why he needed that alone time, and also no doubt praying for his disciples, that they would be able to overcome all of that. So the last thing we'll notice here at the end of John chapter 6, verse 66, as we noted, many disciples went away. Verse 67, Jesus says unto the 12, will ye also go away? Then Simon Peter answered him, Lord, to whom shall we go? Thou hast the words of eternal life, and we believe and are sure that thou art that Christ, the Son of the living God. They didn't understand everything that meant, and they hadn't fully grasped all of what Jesus was doing and teaching, but they knew who he was, and that if they had been wrong, he was the one to correct them. And Peter says, we're not going anywhere. And they and a few others would remain faithful throughout the rest of Jesus' ministry. And then, of course, he brings up there Judas. Even though he was there, his heart was with the crowd that went away. And this is the beginning of his fall into betraying Jesus. So I thought it was important to notice that in connection with what happens when Jesus is walking on the water and why he would pass his disciples by and those things. Lord willing, next time we'll look again at that miracle in the end of Mark chapter 6 and finish that up. And if we have time, we'll go on into chapter 7. But anyway, we'll stop here. We'll pick up there in our next lesson.